Extras.
A lot of the details are unclear regarding the persona of Del. How long had Delta been living among and manipulating the orcs? Had there been a real orc named Del, who the Dark Ancient replaced, or did he start from scratch to infiltrate the Desert Orc community? The one piece of evidence we have is the name. The coincidence of the Dark Ancient known as Delta finding an orc to replace who happened to be named Del would be quite a challenge to the suspension of disbelief. Then again, perhaps he copied a formerly living orc's look and behavior and simply changed his name. Then there's the body itself. Delta was a specialist transmuter. And transmutation is a very flexible school of magic, excellent for combat buffs and mobility buffs, but also the type of magic used to repair damage to constructs. As living constructs, their special creature type, Warforged receive half the effect of normal magical healing, whereas golems are unaffected. But both Warforged and Golems get 100% of the effect of hit point repair spells. Unlike TR4, Delta could also cast a couple conjuration spells. He had different specialist bard schools, but keeping a Terminator-like layer of flesh alive on a non-living stone body would have been pretty difficult. Instead, he seemed to have been quite skilled at manipulating and transmuting the flesh of other recently deceased orcs in order to preserve its appearance and smell. The intentionally crude stitches and carefully crafted scarring at the joins helped present the appearance of scarred battle wounds, which are quite common among orcs, though to be covered head to toe by so many injuries pushed the boundaries of what was believable. Fortunately for him, his powerful and durable stone body, combined with his combat buffs, allowed him to prove his strength as a warrior whenever necessary, despite the brutal simplicity of his martial technique compared to the surprising precision and mastery of form shown by many of Kajor's boys. Side note, Del had a couple feats from the complete mage book. Minor shapeshift, as mentioned in the video, allowed him to gain temp HP equal to his caster level as a swift action whenever he wants, as long as he has a 4th level transmutation memorized. He also had the toughening transmutation feat, which lets him grant DR 5/magic to himself or one of the targets each time he casts a transmutation spell, or if the recipient already has DR, he can increase that by 5 instead, which is much better because DR 5/magic really doesn't do much in 3.5. Of course, the orc-sized stone golem itself raises other questions. A medium-sized golem, nearly as powerful as the standard large ones, with an orc-like body shape, that's not something you find just lying around. Did Delta, or some other Dark Ancient, manipulate or mind control some suckers into building it for him? Or, with patience and the vast stretch of time available to the parasitic immortals, have the Dark Ancients the skill and power to craft custom golems themselves? And if so, why do they seem to focus and prey on Warforged so much? I will share the important detail, in case I haven't mentioned it before, that having originated as Warforged themselves, the Dark Ancients are much more compatible with Warforged bodies. They can live on for decades in a young Warforged body, but the strain of inhabiting golems and other true constructs typically causes them to burn through that body in a much shorter period of time. So, while they almost always use big nasty golems when you encounter them in combat, they do tend to want Warforged bodies to reside in the majority of the time, saving those golems for when might is needed. When Del reappeared in the digging machine, it made it much more clear what had happened way back in the maintenance station, if perhaps not why it happened. However he learned of the archaeologist's discovery, it appears that Del had not known of the location of the small Ataran facility until then. It's hard to say if Delta had anything to do with the Gruul orcs who kidnapped them. It may just have been a coincidence. But he clearly sent Hag and her boys to recover the item for him, whether he actually wanted it or just wanted to keep the secret of the location. Meanwhile, we now know Delta visited the maintenance station himself. The archaeologists went down the ramp and ended up in the tram, but never figured out how to activate the lift to lower it down to the tunnel, assuming the mechanism still even worked. Delta, on the other hand, understood what this place really was, and simply bashed a space in the corner with his massive strength so he could drop down into the room. There, he found the digging machine, which he used to smash all the equipment before drilling his way out, creating that massive hole in the wall. And of course, he used it to collapse the northward tunnel in 3 places, as we saw. Of course, there are logistical issues to trying to keep multiple bodies around. It's a common issue for Dark Ancients. You always want at least one other construct nearby into which you can jump if something goes wrong. Specifically, a construct you have already previously inhabited. They usually have crappy saving throws against any magic that actually affects constructs, but if they are resisting, there's still a chance that you could fail to transfer your consciousness at the worst possible time. You don't take risks like that with your life. On the other hand, once they have taken over a construct, if they then leave that body, it becomes an empty vessel. They can possess it automatically with no possibility of failure, but it can no longer walk around on its own, becoming effectively a piece of luggage. When they defeated Beta, Draven guessed with impressive accuracy its strategy, a buried homunculus. It's a feeble body, and possibly one Beta just took from those artificers he had mind-controlled, but homunculi are small, easy to hide, and they can fly, so you can imagine him carrying one around with him when traveling as a golem, or even in a backpack when moving as a regular warforged. With Delta and the digging machine, it becomes somewhat more problematic. He can't pretend to be an orc unless he's in the Del body, and even if he were strong enough to drag the huge construct around, it would be just a little suspicious. If he were traveling on his own, he could do so by leapfrogging. Move the tunneling machine to around the limits of his transfer range. We still haven't learned much about that particular limitation. Then transfer back and walk his orc body past it by the same distance. Repeat until he arrives at his destination. That takes a long time, though, traveling twice the distance in effect, and it's hard to see how he could do so when traveling with other orcs. They're unsubtle, but most of them are not morons, and it would be a mistake to assume that their lack of respect for secrecy somehow implies that orcs are not intellectually curious. Quite the opposite. They love to find new places and things. The other possibility could be to bundle up his orc body somehow to protect it, strap himself to the back of the worm-like digger, and then transfer into it and tunnel all the way to his destination. Jump back into Del, cut himself loose, and walk back to meet with Liz and her friends. Either way, though, he must have stashed the body near the northern terminus first, then later come back with his orcs before actually attacking the station. But he had to have used the tunneling machine to attack the force wall pylons, as TR4 mentioned in episode 33, and the orcs were there when he did it, right? If questioned about Del's behavior, Liz could explain about Del's magicking trance. When the orc lieutenant would sometimes sit down and meditate, sometimes for long periods, to divine information. It's part of how he's so smart. In particular, he told Liz, Pog, and Varn he needed to use his magic to get them into this place, and entered his magicking trance. That was his excuse, as he transferred to the waiting golem underground, to disrupt the force fields with his knowledge of Ataran technology. Later, when he found himself losing to the party, he jumped back to the golem and teleported the camel down to keep them occupied, or if he was really lucky, to kill them, as he recast his combat buffs. He didn't want to leave them too long to heal and buff themselves, and maybe acted a little rashly, because if Delta had waited an extra round to cast a fly spell, which he did have memorized, he might have been able to keep on Draven and finish him, while making it harder for Black and Little One to beat on him until he'd removed the caster. Side note, the video showed a massive flow of sand funneling down into the room, because that's what worked for me visually and in ease of animation, but really it was more of an initial pile of rocky rubble and sand, after which the crushed rock staunched most of the flow of sand into the terminus. First off, I want to clarify that when Del returned, TR4's positioning was much less dumb than the way I needed to show it in the video. He actually stayed around the corner and out of line of sight, with Angel positioned right near the corner of the tunnel where she could see TR4, but, most of the time, could still shoot at Delta. Unfortunately, as mentioned, line of sight was not an issue. It is sadly ironic that GE7, who was scripted to sacrifice himself and die, was saved by the heroes, whereas TR4, who benefited from vastly more characterization, both at the table and in the videos, had to die. Actually, I had figured in planning he had about a 50-50 chance, but while I hadn't planned a whole lot for him to survive, I'm confident he would have been much more interesting than GE7, who, as a level 7 priest, was too powerful to join the party at that point in time. Now, not that I've heard anyone complaining that my campaign world, and particularly the Terran stuff, goes too sci-fi for D&D. I would like to point out that the teleportation detector in the Terminus is effectively a magic item version of spells from the spell compendium. Anticipate teleportation, and in this case, greater anticipate teleportation. It's a 24-hour buff spell that allows a touched creature to sense teleportation arrivals in a radius of 5 feet per caster level. The level 3 version delays the arrival for 1 round while informing you of the number and sizes of the creatures teleporting in. The level 6 version delays the arrival for 3 rounds, and actually gives the creature types as well, though TR4's implementation doesn't have a user interface to portray that information. His displays the arrival's position and size by a pair of perpendicular glowing red pulses along the walls and floor, and the thickness of the indicator displays the size. And I would like to reiterate that this is the reason it was totally reasonable for me to take Draven's cautious dimension door into the station and use it to trap them in the Force Wall Cube. That doesn't mean I was any more correct to have Mora forget the plan, which they made, but which totally didn't register with me at the time, in which she was supposed to wait for a message from Angel that everything was safe before teleporting over with Rainbow Dash. On the other hand, I hold that, with my narrator's demi-omniscience, that decision was extremely unlikely to harm them in any way, and was in fact much funnier than the alternative. I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in the unknown spell TR4 used to push the Force Cube away. It was, of course, made up and not necessarily designed with the care of a proper spell intended to be shared, but the spell, listed on TR4's memorizations as Akira, though it should probably be named Biometallic Surge or something. Biometallic Surge is a level 4 arcane transmutation. Instantaneous, target one creature or object, range 60 feet, somatic and material components. It deals 1d6 bludgeoning damage per caster level, cap 10d6, and either pulls the target towards the caster or pushes them away up to the spell's 60-foot range. The caster can choose to end the pushing or pulling effect at any point along the line. A Fortitude save negates the damage to and movement of the primary target. Regardless of that save, any other targets along the line between the caster and the target must make a reflex save against the damage only. A successful reflex save for the secondary target negates the damage. Use the longest distance for calculating what secondary targets are affected. So if the caster is pulling the target, you use the target's starting point to draw the line. If the caster is pushing the target and the target fails the Fortitude save, then you instead draw the line from the target's destination point. In any case, if a target is pushed or pulled off a cliff or into another hazard, the DM should allow a separate reflex save to catch the edge or otherwise avoid that hazard. This DC should be related to the hazard, fall, etc., rather than the spell's DC, so it's not related to the spellcaster's ability score. Now, this spell isn't all that special or interesting, but I would attempt to make it more of a flavor thing, perhaps making it available only to casters who have both biological parts and at least one metal limb, which would be the material focus. So any metallic warforged, druid forged, or a humanoid spellcaster who ends up with a magical metal hand for some reason, etc. Or you could make a version that is a druid spell which generates a surge of tree or vine growth from the limb, rather than metal. In any case, as an instantaneous spell, the additional matter produced dissolves away within a round, leaving the caster's limb as it was. I do find it funny to spend all this time on a plot hook that they decide not to take. I presented it knowing there was a good chance they wouldn't jump at it. It was simultaneously tempting because they could save their friends, they're supposed to be treasure, and it would be easier if they could get there in time. But it also sounds ridiculously hard if they weren't in time to intercept the prison transfer. One thing I didn't expect was how they would interpret this as doing the bidding of the Rahjs. Whereas in this case, at least, I believe this was more the Rahjs making an effort to help out the party, to thank them for their work with the earlier shackle. I mean, they would like the heroes to spend that favor, so reminding of that was a bit of a side motive. But I didn't expect the interpretation that the Rahjs were trying to make the heroes do them another favor and spend the owed favor on them, which would indeed have been pretty asinine. I think the biggest strike against going to the Shadowfell right away, though, was the time frame. The Rahjs couldn't be any more specific than make all haste, because that is a limitation of the particular divination that yielded that information. Clearly one of the more Fey-inspired spells. But that's way too ambiguous. Does that mean you have to get on horses, ride all the way back through Vistria, then plane shift, and you'll probably be there in time? Or would you have to take a less obvious route or shortcut? Do you have to literally teleport to get there in time? If it's as fast as they could possibly go, that's a perfectly reasonable interpretation. And could you do that, spend the Eldritch Eye, and somehow still be too late because of the time you spend asking questions or making other reasonable and quick preparations? It was all too iffy. Yes, as I hear, we'll have to wait. And after the early Patreon preview, Warsaw asked, what would Delta have done with a mangled TR4 body next had Angel not one-shotted him? If Angel had missed, multiple times since she had more attacks left, he would have been in a pretty rough situation. Against opponents less familiar with Dark Ancients, he probably would have tried to masquerade as TR4, but he'd heard Beta's report, so he knew that wouldn't work. His next best chance for survival would have been to hold their friend hostage, explaining that he could preserve TR4's mind if they let him get to safety. That also had little chance of working against the party, but it would have been harder for Delta to know or guess whether they could be fooled, because it would be a complete lie. After that, since he didn't have any more teleportation abilities left in his very limited amount of non-transmutation spell slots, his best option would probably have been to cast Fly to overcome TR4's unimpressive movement speed, and flee down the hallway looking for an opportunity for some last desperate play. He definitely did still have spells left. In fact, if his true hit points hadn't been worn down, he might have been able to stage a comeback by using his minor shapeshift feat to give him some temp HP each round, and casting Flame Whips to transmute himself a pair of flaming 15-foot touch attack weapons, with which even TR4's body might be able to finish off weakened enemies. Of course, as far as what Delta wanted with TR4's body had he won the battle, obviously there's certain information he was hoping the old Warforged knew. Whether or not the data he wanted was there, either way, learning that probably made the Dark Ancients' last moments a little bit more frustrating. I want to give a big thanks to all my generous Patreon patrons who got to watch this video first and had a chance to give feedback on any topics I might have missed, so I might include them in the final video. It doesn't have to be Warsaw. If you have a question that I can give a good non-spoilery answer to, it could be you. And if you can't afford to contribute financially or just don't feel like it, remember, it doesn't cost you a dime to like and share Tales from My D&D campaign.